Welcome back to Things You Don't Know. I'm Dr. Weaver, and joining me, as always, is our resident historian, Dr. Deneen. God, we are so fortunate to have him. Today, we're uncovering a CIA program that sounds like pure science fiction, a top secret effort to train, this is for real, folks, psychic spies. Psychic spies during the Cold War. Yeah. I swear you're hearing it right. The U.S. government actually spent 2 decades experimenting with ESP and psychic abilities for intelligence gathering. Dr. Deneen, this project went by an intriguing name, didn't it?
It certainly did. That's right, Dr. Weaver. It was ultimately known as Project Stargate. And unlike many urban legends, this one is real. Nothing surprises me anymore. For over 20 years, various U.S. intelligence agencies funded research into whether psychic phenomena, especially something called remote viewing, could be used as a tool for spying. It reads like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, but it happened under wraps in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
And to set the scene here, it's the height of the Cold War. The U.S. and Soviet Union are locked in an arms race, a space race, and apparently even a psychic race. Reports filtered in that the Soviets were pouring resources into ESP research. American officials grew worried about a potential ESP gap, echoing the earlier bomber gap and missile gap fears. As one science correspondent later put it, at the height of the Cold War, there was the ESP gap. Reports that the Soviets were using psychics to spy on us and prompting us to do the same to them. In other words, if psychic spying was possible, the U.S. felt it couldn't afford to fall behind.
In the early 1970s, the CIA responded to those reports by quietly funding experiments into psychic phenomena. This effort went through many code names. Project Scanate for Scan by Coordinate in 1972, later Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, and Center Lane. And by the late 80s, it was consolidated under the umbrella name Stargate. Different names, same idea. To figure out if things like telepathy, clairvoyance, or psychokinesis could give us an intelligence edge.
So, how does one conduct a psychic experiment for the CIA? Well, one early approach was literally to test self-proclaimed psychics. In 1973, the CIA brought in celebrity psychic Uri Geller for a week of experiments at Stanford Research Institution. They locked him in a room and challenged him to do things like see hidden drawings in sealed envelopes, find buried metal, and bend spoons with his mind. Believe it or not, the initial results impressed the test team. They reported that Geller demonstrated his paranormal perceptual ability in a convincing and unambiguous manner. That is straight from the CIA's own report at the time.
Certainly. However, this early enthusiasm didn't last. The CIA wisely brought in an outside skeptic, psychologist Ray Hyman, to evaluate Geller. Hyman observed Geller and concluded he was a fraud, catching him using tricks that the scientists had missed. This skepticism set the tone. Even within the government, believers and doubters were apparently locked in debate from the very beginning. But the seed was planted. If not Geller, maybe someone out there had genuine psychic ability worth harnessing.
And that brings us to what would become the core of Project Stargate, remote viewing. And Dr. Deneen, could you break down what remote viewing actually means, please?
Absolutely, Dr. Weaver. Remote viewing It's essentially clairvoyance under very controlled conditions. The idea is to have individuals, called remote viewers, sit in a quiet room and attempt to visualize details of distant locations, objects, or events they've never seen with their own eyes. Typically, a viewer is given some kind of target cue, for example, geographic coordinates or a photograph sealed in an envelope, and they're asked to describe what they, quote, see in their mind's eye. This could mean sketching the layout of a building thousands of miles away or identifying objects at a secret site purely through psychic perception. No gadgets, just concentration.
It sounds unbelievable. Did they have any success with that method?
In the early days, there were some surprisingly encouraging results, or at least results that were hard to immediately dismiss. The CIA had contracted two physicists at the Stanford Research Institute, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, who in turn worked with a few supposedly gifted individuals. Two of the most notable were Ingo Swann and Pat Price. These names would become legendary in remote viewing lore. Ingo Swann was a New York artist and psychic who helped pioneer the techniques. In one famous instance, Swann claimed he could psychically see details about the planet Jupiter, and he described features like Jupiter's rings months before NASA's Pioneer 10 spacecraft confirmed that Jupiter indeed has faint rings. This story is often cited as evidence that Swann had some genuine ability, although skeptics argue it could be coincidence or prior knowledge. Pat Price, a former police officer, produced what is perhaps one of the most celebrated remote viewing hits. In the mid 1970s, Price accurately described details of a secret Soviet military site, a site he had never physically seen. According to declassified accounts, Price gave specifics about a Soviet weapons laboratory that were later verified by satellite imagery.
Do we know exactly what he saw? This is where things get pretty intriguing.
Yes, we have some testimony about it. In July 1974, Pat Price was asked to remote view a location on the USSR known only by geographic coordinates. He sketched and described facilities he saw there. Years later, one of the project's scientists, Dr. Edwin May, explained what Price had accomplished. He accurately described a huge crane that was known to be there. He went on later to describe underground spears, and these spears were later confirmed by other intelligence techniques. In other words, Price's psychic sketch showed a large gantry crane at this top secret Soviet nuclear site, and indeed such a crane was present. He mentioned some kind of spherical structures underground that also turned out to be real.
That's astounding. A man in California drawing details of a hidden Soviet installation on the other side of the world. Details later confirmed by satellite and spies. It's like a scene from a bad spy novel.
It really is, and stories like that kept interest in the program alive. As another example, early remote viewers were even enlisted to spy on Soviet nuclear tests. They attempted to sketch the layout of the test tunnels and facilities at Semiplakhanik, a major USSR nuclear test site purely from psychic perception. One CIA report noted that these psychic impressions included much detailed, accurate information confirmed later by HUMINT, that means human intelligence, and technical sources about the semi-plastic site. So, at least in a few cases, the results were good enough that officials took notice.
And all this was classified, of course. We should remind listeners these were not public experiments. This was covert, need to know only. In fact, one insider later revealed that only about 100 people ever were even cleared to know Project Stargate existed. This was deep in the shadows.
That's correct. One Army officer, Major Ed Dames, said it was top secret and highly restricted. Congressmen who knew about it kept their distance to avoid being ridiculed. Dames quipped that within the intel community, we were kind of the red light district of the intelligence community. This was a spooky back alley program nobody wanted to publicly admit visiting. It had a stigma. Many traditional boots on the ground intelligence folks were embarrassed by the very idea of psychic research. Yet, even with the skepticism, the United States Army eventually took over much of the work from the CIA. But by 1978, the program shifted to an Army unit at Fort Meade, Maryland. From then through the 1980s, remote viewing was used in actual military and espionage operations, albeit as a small scale experimental support tool.
Yeah, and those people working at Fort Meade, they were they were very closely guarded. They knew not to say anything. So let's talk about how these psychic spies were actually deployed. We have this image of individuals sitting in dark rooms, drawing sketches of enemy bases. How did a remote viewing session actually typically go?
Well, we have firsthand descriptions from the people that were there. Army Captain Joe McMoneagle, one of the most prolific remote viewers, later designated remote viewer number one, described the process like this. The way we work, he said, is usually by sitting in a room that is empty of furniture, except maybe for a desk or a table with very low lighting so as not to be distracting. There'd usually be a monitor or interviewer present to give the target cue and quietly prompt the viewer. The viewer might close their eyes, concentrate, and start describing images or impressions. Often they'd sketch as they talked, rough drawings of shapes, structures, or anything else that came to mind. It sounds very meditative. McMoneagle said they could describe, through sketches and words, people, places, and things hundreds or even thousands of miles away that they'd never seen. The key was not to force it, just report whatever mental impressions arose, no matter how vague. Afterwards, intelligence analysts would compare these impressions to real world data and see if anything matched up.
It wasn't just exercises in the lab. They actually tried to apply this in real intelligence cases. Let's dig into a few of the more dramatic missions these psychic spies took on. One famous case, the Iran hostage crisis in 1979. Now, when Iranian militants took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, dozens of American diplomats were held hostage. But U.S. intel faced a mystery. Some hostages were not at the embassy. They'd been moved to a secret location. Traditional intelligence couldn't pinpoint where those extra hostages were being held. So they turned, in part, to remote viewers.
That's right. Several military remote viewers were tasked with psychically searching for those hidden hostages. According to one of the Army officers involved, again, Joe McMoneagle, the remote viewers were able to identify the location where the hostages were being held. No one seemed to know exactly where that was, but we were instrumental in helping identify that location, he said. They described the inside and outside of the location to an extent, giving vital clues to analysts. Now, it's hard to independently verify how accurate their visions were in that case because some details remain classified, but Project insiders consider it a success. They believe they helped narrow down the search for the hostages.
Another dramatic situation came a couple of years later. in 1981. Brigadier General James Dozier, a U.S. Army officer stationed with NATO in Italy, was kidnapped by a terrorist group, the Red Brigades. For weeks, Italian police and U.S. intelligence were frantically trying to find where the terrorists were holding Dozier. And guess who they quietly called in to assist?
The remote viewers, exactly. This was now under the control of the Army Defense Intelligence Agency program, codenamed Grillflame. That's an earlier name for Stargate. Dale Graff, who was the DIA Stargate program manager in the 80s, later confirmed how they tackled Dozer's case. We had one viewer come up with the name of the city, Padua. We had another one come up with the name of the building he was in. And indeed, General Dozier was found by the Italian authorities in Padua, Italy, in an apartment hideout. In fact, one of the psychics even described the description of the room he was being held in, how he was being held chained to a heater, details which matched reality. Another officer who was there, identified as Joe McGonigal again in one interview, said the information was accurate. It was absolutely accurate. The psychics seemingly nailed the key details of Dozer's location. Now, to be clear, it was the Italian police who ultimately stormed the hideout and rescued Dozer, but the remote viewing team took credit for providing crucial hints. At a minimum, it's an impressive anecdote in the Stargate files.
It gives you chills, doesn't it? Imagine being on that team, watching a psychic sketch the name of an Italian city and building, and then finding out your hostage general was right there. It must have been surreal. And maybe spooky is the word one official used.
Yes, it certainly was, and we have another case that was explicitly called spooky. Let's fast forward to 1989. A former customs agent named Charles Jordan had gone rogue, basically a fugitive from justice. He'd been on the run for 2 years. Law enforcement had no leads. Many assumed he'd fled overseas. A U.S. Customs official later admitted the collective wisdom was he was probably hiding in the Caribbean. They were looking in completely the wrong place, so they tried a different tact and brought in the Stargate team. Dale Graff and his remote viewers went to work. One of the psychics reported a very specific impression describing him in North Wyoming at a campground close to an Indian burial site. It sounded far fetched. Wyoming, not the Caribbean, an eerie detail about an Indian gravesite. But they passed along the tip. Sure enough, acting on various information, including that psychic tip, authorities eventually caught the fugitive in Wyoming near Yellowstone Park next to an Indian reservation with an old gravesite. The custom official, William Green, was blown away. He confirmed that Jordan was found, quote, near the Grand Tetons, near Yellowstone, right next to an Indian reservation, next to an Indian gravesite, just as the remote viewer had indicated, Green said. It couldn't have been much more accurate than that. It was almost spooky.
These successes are remarkable. A downed Soviet bomber, a kidnapped general, a fugitive. In each case, the psychic spies seem to have provided real clues. And I recall one more celebrated case from the late 1970s, something about a Soviet aircraft in Africa.
Yes, this one often tops the list of Stargate wins. In the late 1970s, a Soviet Tu-22 backfire bomber crashed in a remote part of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Soviets wanted to recover or destroy the wreckage to protect their technology. And of course, the US wanted to get to it first. A young Army remote viewer named Rosemary Smith was asked to pinpoint the crash site. She was given a map. According to reports, Rosemary marked an X on the map in a very specific spot where she psychically felt the plane had gone down. Her superiors sent those coordinates to the field, and incredibly, the wreckage was found exactly where she indicated. This allowed U.S. teams to reach the site and extract valuable Soviet technology from the plane before the Soviets got there. Even skeptical analysts had to admit that Rosemary Smith's detailed hit was uncanny. It is cited as by far the most successful case in the grill flame era.
These stories are told with an almost mythic air now. You can see why proponents of Stargate were convinced they had something real. But we should balance this with the other side of the coin. How often did it not work? For every success, how many wild goose chases were there?
Let's be honest, Dr. Weaver, there were many. The truth is, for every astonishing hit, there were dozens of misses or at best murky results. An internal review tallied about 500 operational remote viewing sessions between the 70s and early 90s. Of these, fewer than a dozen were deemed to be clearly on target. In most cases, the psychic descriptions were too vague or just flat out wrong to be useful. Even Stargate's own supporters admitted the inaccurate information far outweighed the good. Remote viewing sessions could produce a lot of nonsense, along with the occasional gem. Viewers might ramble about unrelated imagery or metaphors. It took a skilled analyst to even interpret their sketches. And if an analyst wants to believe, there's a risk of cherry picking hits that match and ignoring the many misses, a classic confirmation bias problem. Skeptics argue that these success stories may be exaggerated or even partly coincidental. For instance, maybe the psychic describes something general enough, like near a mountain and water, that analysts could retroactively fit it to a location. Or perhaps the remote viewers knew some contextual hints in advance, even inadvertently.
It's worth noting that some sessions drifted into bizarre territory. Not all targets were military. I've heard one declassified experiment even had a viewer attempting a psychic trip to Mars 1 million years in the past.
That's true. Ray Bradbury's got nothing on this. In 1984, Joseph Moneygall again was given sealed coordinates that turned out to be Mars 1 million BC as a kind of outlandish test. He reported later seeing Martian ruins, tall, thin extraterrestrials, and so on. Needless to say, that one wasn't exactly actionable intelligence. It was more a curiosity or a prank. But it shows how far the program was willing to stretch the name of experimentation. They also occasionally tasked viewers with hunting for UFOs or alien bases, especially later in the program. These aspects gave more ammunition to the critics who felt the whole thing was a boondoggle verging on the absurd.
And the scientific community? I imagine they were largely unconvinced throughout.
Mainstream scientists were very skeptical, yes. They raised valid concerns, lack of rigorous controls, the possibility of sensory leaks or cues, and the impossibility of reproducing results consistently. For years, this field existed in a strange limbo, classified so it wasn't open to full peer review, but also too controversial to ever be fully embraced. By the early 1990s, with the Cold War over, support was waning. In 1995, the CIA decided to put Project Stargate to the test one final time. They commissioned an independent review by the American Institutes for Research. Two external experts were brought in: Ray Hyman, the psychologist skeptic we mentioned earlier, and Dr. Jessica Utz, a statistics professor who had studied psychic research. These two reviewed all the data and came to starkly different conclusions.
Indeed, Hyman, the skeptic, said, my considered judgment, I'd have to say the odds are 99 to 1 that there's nothing to remote viewing. He basically saw the hits as flukes among a lot of guesswork. He noted that most of the data looked just like what you'd get from chance and imagination.
Now, Utz, on the other hand, argued that the statistical results did show something beyond chance. I think remote viewing has been demonstrated over the 20 years of work. What it proves to me is that we don't quite understand either the nature of the mind or perhaps the nature of time and space. But there's some mystery out there we need to solve. In other words, she felt it was a genuine phenomenon, however small, that merited further scientific study, but even she wasn't claiming it was ready to be an everyday spy tool.
In the end, the skeptics carried the day for the government. The CIA's final report was frankly negative. They concluded that even if something odd was happening in the lab, it had never yielded actionable intelligence. The declassified summary famously stated, quote, even though a statistically significant effect has been observed in the laboratory, it remains unclear whether the existence of a paranormal phenomena has been demonstrated. Most importantly, the information provided by remote viewing is vague and ambiguous, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the technique to yield information of sufficient quality and accuracy for actionable intelligence. Thus, we conclude that continued use of remote viewing in intelligence operation is not warranted. In plain terms, interesting maybe, useful no. And so in 1995, Project Stargate was officially terminated. The psychic spies were let go or reassigned, and the files were archived.
Once the program ended, an awful lot of secrets started coming out. The CIA declassified thousands of pages of Stargate material in the mid 1990s, and later a huge dump in 2017 released even more. Suddenly, the public learned about all these experiments that had only been rumor or speculation before. This inspired books and even a Hollywood movie called The Men Who Stare at Goats, a 2009 film starring George Clooney, which satirically riffs on the Army's psychic research program by calling the psychics Jedi from Star Wars. Okay, the very title of that movie comes from a very real anecdote. Some Army psychic researchers supposedly tried to kill a goat by staring at it, believing in intense psychic influence. It's a wild story, not directly Stargate's intelligence work, but it's part of that same milieu of paranormal military experiments.
It's easy to laugh at the idea of soldiers trying to psychically kill goats or walk through walls, another thing one general famously attempted. But our tone here has been intentionally measured because the people involved in Stargate were serious professionals. Many were military officers, scientists, or officers of the CIA or DIA. They weren't cranks, they were hopeful. They hoped this far out idea just might yield an intelligence breakthrough. And we have to remember why they tried it. Cold War paranoia. As one congressman said in defense of funding this research, it seemed like a hell of a cheap radar system. And if the Russians have it and we don't, we're in serious trouble. The U.S. was willing to explore any edge, no matter how unconventional, to not be left behind. In that context, spending a few million on psychic research out of an intelligence budget was a gamble some were willing to take. In fact, total spending over the whole life of Stargate was only about 20 million. By CIA standards, that's peanuts. Basically research and development money for a high risk, high reward idea.
Well said, Dr. Weaver. And it's true. Even though Project Stargate flamed out in the end, its core premise remains alluring to many. Polls show even today that roughly 6 in 10 Americans believe in some form of psychic phenomena or New Age beliefs. Even today, you'll find private groups teaching remote viewing techniques, often led by some of the very people who were a part of Stargate. For instance, Ed Dames, whom we mentioned, still runs training sessions and claims to use remote viewing to solve crimes or search for missing persons. Joe McMoneagle wrote books about his psychic spying days. Others have ventured into the UFO and paranormal scene. In short, the legacy of Stargate lives on outside government.
So what's the verdict? Did the CIA's psychic spies ever have a real secret weapon? Or was it more a Cold War whimsy? The evidence leans towards the latter, an intriguing dead end. As an official evaluators put it, the overwhelming amount of data is vague, general, and way off target. The few apparent hits were just what we would expect if nothing other than reasonable guessing is operating. Harsh, but probably true. And yet, those tantalizing success stories we recounted remain unexplained. How did Pat Price see that crane? How did Rosemary find that plane? Coincidence? Luck? Something more? We just can't say for sure.
What we can say is for a moment in history, spies and psychics work side by side. It's another story that reminds us just how strange the Cold War really got. The pressure to outthink the enemy led intelligence agencies into realms that seem like pure fantasy. Sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction.
Ultimately, Project Stargate is a fascinating chapter in the annals of espionage, one that leaves us with as many questions as answers. It forces us to ask, how far would we go if we believed even a hint of the paranormal might be real? In the case of the CIA and the Army, they went pretty far, all the way to employing psychic spies in the field. All right, that's our deep dive for today. Who would have thought the CIA once tried to recruit real life Professor X's to fight the Cold War?
It sounds absurd, but it's true. Knowing some of the things I've learned, some of the uses of psychotropic drugs and equilibrium balls, to name two other crazy things, it's not entirely implausible. And now you know the story behind it, the good, the bad, and the weird. We've been appropriately skeptical in our journey, I think, but without mocking the people who earnestly pursued this. They were chasing what they felt could have been a revolutionary breakthrough. In the end, it just didn't pan out.
And that itself is a valuable outcome. Sometimes knowing what doesn't work is as important as finding what does. The U.S. government learned that psychic spying, unfortunately, isn't a reliable tool of national security. All right. Well, for listening to Things You Don't Know. We hope this investigative look at Project Stargate has been as compelling for you as it was for us to research. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and, give us a like too. Who knows what other secrets are out there waiting for us to explore? Until next time, I'm Dr. Weaver.
I'm Dr. Denis. Take care, folks.
All righty. Bye for now.